Appalachian Rage, 767 neighbors, wanted to butcher Robert Pitts for killing his own child. The most precise act of collective fury in Virginia mountain history and the most meticulously documented expression of community justice the Appalachian Highlands had ever witnessed, when 767 neighbors signed their names to a declaration of intent before descending upon a farmstead to execute a father who had starved his own daughter to death. This is the true story of what happened in Wise County in the autumn of 1891. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Wise County, Virginia, in the heart of the Appalachian coalfields, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely self-governing corners of the Commonwealth. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and shale, their hollows sheltering families who had carved lives from wilderness and who had governed themselves according to principles that predated the Constitution and would outlast any government that tried to impose its will upon them. The people who settled these mountains came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit through generations of conflict with outsiders who never understood that these hills had their own laws. You see, in Wise County during the years of our story, the protection of children was not merely a family responsibility, but a sacred obligation that bound the entire community together. The mountain people understood that their survival depended on the next generation, that every child represented hope for the future in a world where the present was often brutal and uncertain. A child who was harmed was not merely an individual victim, but a wound to the community itself, an assault on the collective future that every neighbor had a stake in protecting. This understanding shaped everything that would follow. The unique feature of the Pitts case, the element that distinguished it from every other act of community justice in Appalachian history, was the document. Before the crowd descended upon the Pitts farmstead, before Robert Pitts was seized and executed, 767 individuals signed their names to a written declaration stating their intention to kill him and their reasons for doing so. This document, preserved in the county archives to this day, represents the most explicit statement of community intent ever recorded in connection with an extra-legal execution, a collective assumption of responsibility that transformed what might have been anonymous mob violence into something that the signatories clearly believed was legitimate community action. The document was written in a careful hand, its language formal and deliberate, its tone more judicial than emotional. It began with a statement of the facts as the community understood them, that Robert Pitts had caused the death of his daughter Emma through deliberate starvation and neglect, that the child had suffered for months while her father consumed the food that should have sustained her, that medical examination had confirmed the cause of death as malnutrition so severe that the child's organs had begun to consume themselves. The document then stated the community's conclusion that Robert Pitts had committed murder, that the legal system could not be trusted to deliver adequate justice, and that the undersigned therefore declared their intention to execute him themselves. The signatures that followed filled 7 pages, written in hands that ranged from the elegant script of the educated to the crude marks of those who could not write their own names, but who made their X's with witnesses attesting to their identity. The signatories included farmers and miners and merchants, preachers and teachers and midwives, men and women of every station that the mountain community contained. They signed in family groups and as individuals, some traveling miles through difficult terrain to add their names to a document that they knew might constitute evidence of their participation in a capital crime. The man at the center of this unprecedented declaration was Robert Pitts, a 41-year-old farmer whose land lay in a hollow on the upper reaches of Guest River, a man whose reputation had been declining for years before the events that would end his life. Pitts had inherited his farm from his father, had married a woman named Sarah, who had died giving birth to their 3rd child, and had been raising his children alone for 7 years, with an incompetence that the community had watched with growing concern. The farm had deteriorated under his management, the fields going fallow, the livestock diminishing, the buildings falling into disrepair that reflected the collapse of the man who was supposed to maintain them. That's right. Robert Pitts was known throughout the hollow as a man who had given up, who had surrendered to the hardships of mountain life rather than fighting against them. who had allowed despair to transform him from a functioning member of the community into something that the neighbors regarded with a mixture of pity and contempt. He drank too much, worked too little, spent his days in a stupor that left his children to fend for themselves while he consumed whatever resources the farm still produced. The neighbors had tried to help, had offered assistance that Pitts had accepted without gratitude and squandered without improvement, had eventually concluded that the man was beyond saving. The children had been the focus of the community's concern for years. The eldest, a boy named Thomas, had learned to care for himself and his siblings with a competence that children should not have been required to develop, had become the functional head of the household, while his father descended further into uselessness. The middle child, a boy named William, had followed his brother's lead, had contributed what labor his young body could provide to the maintenance of a household that was slowly collapsing around them. But the youngest, a girl named Emma, had been too small to care for herself, too young to find her own food when her father consumed what should have been hers, too weak to survive the neglect that her brothers had learned to endure. Emma Pitts was 6 years old when she died, a child whose brief life had been marked by a deprivation that no child should ever experience. She had been small from birth, her mother's death having deprived her of the nursing that might have given her a stronger start, and she had never caught up, had remained undersized and underdeveloped through years of inadequate nutrition. The neighbors who saw her remarked on how thin she was, how listless, how her eyes seemed too large for her face in the way that starvation produces, the body consuming its own fat and muscle until only the bones remain. The progression of Emma's decline had been visible to everyone in the hollow, a slow-motion tragedy that the community watched with increasing horror and decreasing ability to intervene. In the spring of 1891, she had still been able to play with the other children of the hollow, though she tired more quickly and lacked the energy that healthy children possessed. By midsummer, she rarely left the cabin, her body no longer able to sustain the activity that childhood required. By September, she could not walk without assistance, her legs too weak to support even her diminished weight, her eyes carrying an exhaustion that seemed impossible in a child so young. The physical signs of starvation were documented by multiple witnesses who would later provide testimony for the declaration. Her hair had begun to fall out in patches, the body withdrawing nutrients from non-essential functions to sustain the organs that were essential to life. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that indicated circulatory problems, the heart no longer able to pump blood efficiently to the extremities. Her belly had become distended in the paradoxical swelling that severe malnutrition produces, the organs expanding as they failed while the rest of the body wasted away. The women of the community had tried to help, had brought food to the Pitts cabin that they hoped would reach the children, had offered to take Emma into their own homes where she could be properly fed and cared for. Robert Pitts had refused every offer, had insisted that his children were his responsibility and no one else's business, had taken the food that the neighbors brought and consumed it himself while his daughter grew thinner and weaker with each passing month. The refusal to accept help while his child starved was the element that transformed the community's pity into something darker, that made them understand that what was happening in the Pitts cabin was not mere incompetence, but something that approached deliberate malice. Martha Combs, the midwife who had delivered Emma, made multiple attempts to intervene in the months before the child's death. She visited the Pitts cabin weekly, bringing food and medicine, checking on Emma's condition, documenting the decline that she was powerless to prevent. Her records, later attached to the community's declaration, showed a progression from concern to alarm to despair, each visit revealing a child who was closer to death than she had been the week before. In one entry, Martha described finding Emma sitting in a corner of the cabin, too weak to stand, watching with enormous eyes as her father ate the food that Martha had brought for the children. Robert Pitts had looked at Martha without shame, had continued eating while his daughter watched, had shown no sign that he understood or cared about the consequences of his actions. Martha had left the cabin in tears, had gone home and told her husband that Emma would not survive the month, that they were watching a child being murdered and could do nothing to stop it. The community's inability to intervene legally was a source of profound frustration that shaped the response to Emma's death. The law recognized a father's authority over his children, provided no clear mechanism for removing children from homes where they were being neglected, offered no remedy for a situation where a parent was slowly starving his child to death. Appeals to the county authorities had produced sympathy, but no action, the officials explaining that they lacked the legal authority to intervene in a family's internal affairs, that Robert Pitts had committed no crime that they could identify and prosecute. Emma died on the morning of October 3, 1891, in the cabin where she had been born and where she had spent her entire short life being slowly starved to death. Thomas found her body when he returned from the morning chores, her small form lying in the bed she shared with her brothers, her eyes open and staring at nothing, her body so wasted that she seemed to weigh nothing when he lifted her. The boy carried his sister outside and set her on the porch, then walked to the nearest neighbor's cabin to report what had happened, his face showing an expression that combined grief with something that might have been relief, the knowledge that at least his sister's suffering was finally over. The neighbor who received the news was a woman named Martha Combs, a midwife who had delivered Emma 6 years earlier and who had watched with helpless anguish as the child slowly starved in a household that should have sustained her. Martha examined the body with professional detachment that barely concealed her fury, documented the signs of malnutrition that were visible even to an untrained eye, and sent her husband to fetch the doctor, who would confirm what she already knew. Then she began to spread the word through the hollow, her voice carrying the news that Emma Pitts was dead, and that her father had killed her as surely as if he had used a knife. The doctor who examined Emma's body was a man named Samuel Howard, a physician who served the mountain communities with a dedication that earned him universal respect. His examination confirmed what Martha had observed. The child had died of starvation, her body showing the characteristic signs of severe and prolonged malnutrition. Her organs had begun to fail weeks before her death, her body consuming its own tissue in a desperate attempt to survive, her heart finally giving out when there was nothing left to sustain it. Howard documented his findings in a report that would later be attached to the community's declaration, his medical authority lending weight to the judgment that the neighbors had already reached. The community's response to Emma's death was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the news spreading through the hollow, men and women were gathering at the Combs cabin to discuss what should be done. The discussion was not about whether Robert Pitts deserved to die. That question had been answered by the sight of Emma's wasted body, but about how the execution should be carried out and how the community should acknowledge its responsibility for what was about to happen. The decision to create a written document emerged from these discussions, proposed by a schoolteacher named Ezra Collins, who argued that the community should not hide behind anonymity, but should openly declare its intention and its reasons. Collins believed that what they were about to do was not murder but justice, not mob violence but community action, and that they should have the courage to say so publicly. His argument carried the day, and he was tasked with drafting the language that would express the community's will. The document that Collins produced was remarkable for its clarity and its formality. It began with a preamble that established the community's right to act, citing principles of natural law and the failure of civil authority to protect the innocent. It then presented the facts of Emma's death in language that was precise and damning, documenting the months of starvation, the refused offers of help, the consumption of food by the father while his daughter wasted away. It concluded with a statement of intent that left no ambiguity about what the signatories planned to do and why they believed they were justified in doing it. The signing began on the afternoon of October 4th, one day after Emma's death, and continued through the following morning. The signatories came from every hollow in the upper Guest River drainage, from mining camps and farms, and the small communities that clustered at crossroads and creek junctions. They came in family groups and as individuals, some walking miles through the autumn hills, to add their names to a document that they knew might constitute evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. By the time the signing was complete, 767 names filled the pages, a number that represented a significant majority of the adult population of the entire region. The signing itself took on the character of a ritual, a solemn ceremony that the participants understood as marking their commitment to an action that could not be undone. Each person who signed was required to read the declaration aloud or to have it read to them if they could not read, before adding their name. This requirement ensured that every signatory understood exactly what they were committing to, that no one could later claim ignorance of the document's purpose or content. The atmosphere at the signing was described by witnesses as both somber and determined. There was no celebration, no expressions of anticipation or excitement about the violence to come. The signatories approached the document with the gravity that the situation demanded, understood that they were participating in something that would define their community for generations to come. Some wept as they signed, their grief for Emma mixing with their resolve to see justice done. Others showed faces of stone, their emotions controlled by a determination that allowed no display of weakness. The presence of women among the signatories was particularly noted by observers, representing a significant departure from the usual pattern of community justice in Appalachia. 143 women signed the declaration, their names interspersed among those of the men, their participation representing a claim to equal voice in matters of life and death. Many of these women were mothers who had watched Emma's decline with particular anguish, who had tried to help and been rebuffed, who felt a personal responsibility for a child they had been unable to save. The youngest signatory was 16 years old, a boy named Samuel Collins, who was the son of the schoolteacher who had drafted the document. The oldest was 73, a woman named Elizabeth Combs, who had been a midwife for 50 years and who had delivered 3 generations of children in the Hollow. She signed with a hand that trembled from age, but that formed the letters of her name with unmistakable clarity, her participation representing the accumulated wisdom and authority of the community's eldest members. The precision of the count was deliberate. Collins had numbered each signature as it was added, maintaining a careful record that would allow the community to know exactly how many of its members had committed themselves to the action. The number 767 became significant in the community's memory, repeated in songs and stories, as proof that what had been done was not the work of a mob, but the deliberate decision of a community that had counted its members and found them united. The crowd that descended upon the Pitts farmstead on the morning of October 5th was not a mob but an army, organized into groups that approached from different directions to ensure that their target could not escape. They moved through the autumn morning with a discipline that reflected the deliberation of their planning. Their approach coordinated through signals that had been agreed upon the previous evening. The leaves were turning on the mountainsides, the colors of fall providing a backdrop of beauty that contrasted strangely with the purpose that had brought them together. Robert Pitts was found in his cabin, drunk as usual, apparently unaware that the community had decided his fate and was coming to enforce it. The cabin showed the signs of years of neglect, its roof sagging, its walls showing gaps where the chinking had fallen out, its interior a chaos of unwashed dishes and dirty clothing, and the accumulated debris of a household that had ceased to function. The contrast with the cabins of the signatories, who maintained their homes with the care that mountain survival required, made visible the dysfunction that had killed Emma. He offered no resistance when they seized him, seemed almost confused by the number of people who had come, asked questions that no one bothered to answer. Some witnesses reported that he asked where Emma was, that he seemed genuinely not to understand that his daughter was dead, that his confusion suggested either a profound detachment from reality or a level of intoxication that had obliterated his awareness of recent events. Others reported that he asked why so many people had come, that he looked at the faces surrounding him as though searching for an explanation that no one would provide. They brought him to a clearing near the cabin, a spot where a large oak tree provided the branch that would serve their purpose. The clearing had been chosen deliberately, a place where the entire crowd could gather and witness the execution, where the act would be performed in the open rather than in secret. The morning sun filtered through the turning leaves, casting patterns of light and shadow across the faces of the 767 people who had come to see justice done. The declaration was read aloud, Collins's voice carrying across the assembled crowd, the words documenting Emma's death, and the community's decision with a formality that seemed almost judicial. The reading took nearly 10 minutes, the document's careful language demanding careful delivery, the list of facts building toward the conclusion that the signatories had reached. Robert Pitts listened with an expression that witnesses later described as bewildered, as though he could not understand why his daughter's death had produced this response, as though he genuinely did not comprehend what he had done. When the reading was complete, Collins asked if any present wished to speak before the sentence was carried out. Several did. Martha Combs described her visits to the cabin, her attempts to save Emma, the moment when she had watched Robert Pitts eat food meant for his dying child. Her voice broke as she spoke. The grief of a midwife who had delivered a child and then watched her starve, breaking through the composure that had sustained her through the previous days. Thomas, Emma's 12-year-old brother, was asked if he wished to speak, but declined, his face showing an expression that combined grief and shame and something that might have been relief. He had done everything he could to save his sister, had begged his father for food, had tried to share his own inadequate rations with her, and had watched her die anyway. Now he stood among the people who were about to execute his father, his position impossible, his silence the only response that made sense. The execution was carried out with the same deliberation that had characterized the entire process. A rope was produced, a noose was tied, and Robert Pitts was placed on a wagon beneath the oak tree's branch. He was asked if he had anything to say, and he muttered something that the witnesses could not clearly hear, words that might have been a denial of responsibility or might have been a request for mercy. No one responded. The silence of the crowd was absolute. 767 people holding their breath as the final moment approached. The wagon was driven forward, and Robert Pitts dropped, his neck breaking with the sound that all hangings produce, his body swinging in the autumn air, while 767 people watched in silence. The body convulsed once, twice, then hung still, the rope creaking as it swung gently in the morning breeze. The witnesses reported that no one spoke for a long moment after the movement stopped, that the only sounds were the wind in the turning leaves and the distant call of a crow from somewhere on the ridgeline above. Then, one by one, the signatories began to disperse, returning to the homes and farms and mines that required their labor, leaving behind the body that hung from the oak tree as evidence of what they had done. They did not hurry, did not flee as though ashamed of their actions, walked away with the measured pace of people who had completed a necessary task and were now returning to the ordinary business of their lives. The body was left hanging until the following morning, when it was cut down and buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the property. The grave was dug by volunteers who understood that even Robert Pitts deserved burial, that leaving his body for the animals would be a desecration that the community was not willing to commit. No funeral was held, no words were spoken over the grave. No marker was placed to indicate where the man who had starved his daughter lay buried. The community had passed its judgment and carried out its sentence, and now it was done with Robert Pitts, consigning him to an anonymity in death that matched the neglect he had shown his daughter in life. The surviving children, Thomas and William, were taken in by families who had signed the declaration, neighbors who had watched the boys struggle to maintain a household that their father had abandoned, and who now offered them the care that they should have received all along. Thomas was 12 years old enough to understand what had happened and why, old enough to have complicated feelings about the execution of a father who had been worse than useless, but who had still been his father. William was 9, young enough that the community hoped he might eventually forget the worst of what he had experienced, might build a life that was not defined by the trauma of his childhood. The placement of the boys was handled with the same deliberation that had characterized the community's response to Emma's death. A meeting was held to determine which families could best provide for them, which homes could absorb additional children without undue hardship, which households offered the stability that the boys had never known. Thomas was taken in by the Collins family, the schoolteacher's household, offering educational opportunities that might allow him to build a future beyond the hollow. William went to the Combs family, Martha's home providing the maternal care that he had lost when his mother died and that his father had never attempted to replace. Both boys struggled in the years that followed, their trauma manifesting in ways that the families who took them in had to learn to accommodate. Thomas became withdrawn, spending hours alone in the woods, seeking a solitude that might have been healing or might have been hiding. He rarely spoke of his father or his sister, seemed to prefer that the past remain buried along with both of them, built a wall around his memories that no one could penetrate. William's trauma expressed itself differently, in nightmares that woke the household and in an anxiety about food that persisted for years. He hoarded scraps, hid bread in his clothing, ate with a desperation that reflected the years when eating had never been certain. Martha worked patiently with him, assured him daily that there would always be enough food, tried to heal through abundance the wounds that scarcity had inflicted. Both boys eventually built lives that transcended their origins. Thomas became a teacher himself, following in the footsteps of the man who had taken him in, spending his career in the very community that had executed his father and raised him after his father's death. He never married, never had children, seemed to prefer a solitude that kept him at a slight remove from the community even as he served it. He died in 1947 at the age of 68, having lived a quiet life that the violence of his childhood might not have predicted. William married and raised a family, his children growing up in a household where food was abundant and where their father's anxiety about their nutrition seemed excessive but understandable given what they knew of his history. He became a miner, then a mine supervisor, built a prosperity that his father had squandered and that he was determined his children would inherit. He died in 1953 at the age of 71, having outlived his brother by 6 years, having built from the wreckage of his childhood a life that was ordinary in the best sense of the word. The legal aftermath of the Pitts execution was unlike anything that had followed other acts of community justice in Appalachian history. The existence of the signed declaration made it impossible to claim that the perpetrators were unknown, impossible to hide behind the anonymity that had protected participants in other lynchings. 767 people had signed their names to a document stating their intention to kill Robert Pitts, and that document was now in the hands of authorities who theoretically had the power to prosecute them all. The Commonwealth's attorney who received the case was a man named James Taylor, a prosecutor whose jurisdiction included Wise County and who found himself confronting a situation that had no precedent in Virginia law. He had a document confessing to conspiracy and murder, signed by nearly 800 people, representing the majority of the adult population of an entire region. He had witnesses who could testify to the execution itself. He had everything he needed to bring prosecutions, except for the practical ability to do so and the political wisdom to attempt it. Taylor's decision not to prosecute was based on multiple factors that he documented in a memorandum that has survived in the state archives. He noted that prosecuting 767 people was practically impossible, that the courts lacked the capacity to try so many defendants, that juries drawn from the same population would never convict. He noted that the community had acted in response to a genuine crime, that Robert Pitts had demonstrably caused his daughter's death through deliberate neglect, that the legal system had no clear mechanism for punishing such conduct adequately. And he noted that attempting prosecution would likely produce violence that would far exceed what had already occurred, that the community that had united to execute Robert Pitts would unite again to resist any attempt to punish them for doing so. The memorandum concluded with a recommendation that no charges be filed, a recommendation that Taylor's superiors accepted with evident relief. The case was officially closed. The declaration was filed in the county archives where it remains to this day, and the community that had killed Robert Pitts was left to remember what it had done without legal consequence. The legal aftermath of the Pitts case had broader implications that extended beyond Wise County. The case was discussed in legal journals and newspapers throughout Virginia and beyond, becoming a reference point in debates about the limits of prosecutorial discretion and the challenges of enforcing law against communities that were united in their resistance. Some commentators argued that Taylor had made the right decision, that prosecuting 767 people would have been a futile gesture that would only have inflamed tensions without producing justice. Others argued that his failure to prosecute had established a dangerous precedent, that communities throughout Appalachia would now believe they could act with impunity as long as they acted in sufficient numbers. The reforms that followed the case addressed some of the legal gaps that had made the community's intervention seem necessary. Virginia passed legislation in 1893 that established clearer grounds for removing children from homes where they were being neglected, that defined parental neglect as a criminal offense subject to prosecution, that gave county authorities tools they had previously lacked to intervene in situations like the one that had killed Emma Pitts. These reforms came too late for Emma, but may have saved other children in the decades that followed. The social services that developed in the region in subsequent years often traced their origins to the Pitts case, citing Emma's death as the catalyst that had forced recognition of the need for systematic child protection. The informal networks through which mountain communities had traditionally cared for vulnerable children were formalized into institutions that provided more consistent and comprehensive support. The transformation was gradual, occurring over decades rather than years, but the Pitts case was frequently invoked as the event that had demonstrated the necessity of change. The declaration itself became a kind of sacred document in the community's memory, preserved and referenced in ways that suggested the signatories viewed it not as evidence of crime, but as proof of their commitment to justice. Families passed down stories of ancestors who had signed, treating participation in the Pitts execution as a mark of honor rather than shame. The document was occasionally displayed at community gatherings, its 7 pages of signatures a testament to what the mountain people were capable of when united in a cause they believed was right. Copies of the declaration were made and distributed among the families of signatories, each copy becoming a treasured heirloom that documented the family's participation in the community's most significant act of collective justice. These copies were sometimes displayed in homes, framed and hung on walls where visitors could see them, their presence a statement about the family's values and its history. The practice of displaying the declaration persisted into the 20th century, though it became less common as the generations that had participated directly passed away. Emma Pitts was buried in the church cemetery 3 days after her death, her small body laid to rest in ground that the community had prepared with a care that contrasted sharply with the neglect she had experienced in life. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, many of whom had signed the declaration and would participate in her father's execution the following day. The service was conducted by Reverend Ezra Combs, whose sermon spoke of innocence betrayed and justice demanded, whose words made clear that the community's grief for Emma was inseparable from its fury toward the man who had killed her. The grave where Emma rests is still marked, the stone still standing in the cemetery, where generations of mountain families have buried their dead. The inscription is simple, bearing only her name, her dates, and a phrase that the community chose to remember her by: safe in the arms of Jesus. The biblical reference suggested a faith that Emma's suffering was over, that she had found in death the care she had been denied in life, that the God who had allowed her to starve had at least received her into a place where hunger could not reach. The songs that emerged from the Pitts case were different from the ballads that commemorated other acts of mountain justice. These songs focused less on the execution itself than on the document that had preceded it, treating the 767 signatures as the central fact of the story, the element that distinguished what happened in Wise County from ordinary mob violence. The most popular ballad listed the number in its chorus, repeating 767 as a kind of incantation, a reminder that the execution had been the deliberate act of a community that had counted itself and found itself united. The first verse of this ballad described Emma's suffering, painting a picture of a child who grew thinner with each passing month while her father consumed the food that should have sustained her. The melody was mournful, in the minor key that mountain music often employed for songs of tragedy, the notes seeming to carry the weight of the child's hunger and the community's helpless observation of her decline. The second verse described the death itself, the morning when Thomas found his sister's body, the examination that confirmed what everyone already knew, the fury that swept through the hollow as the news spread. The melody shifted here, becoming more urgent, the rhythm quickening as the song moved from tragedy toward response. The third verse described the creation of the document, the school teacher's proposal that the community should openly declare its intention, the signing that continued through 2 days as people traveled from throughout the region to add their names. This verse was almost triumphant in tone, celebrating the community's willingness to take responsibility for what it was about to do. The fourth verse described the execution itself, the reading of the declaration, the silence of the condemned man, the drop of the wagon that left Robert Pitts hanging from the oak tree's branch. The melody returned to its mournful quality here, acknowledging that even justified killing was still killing, that the community had done something terrible, even if it was also something necessary. The final verse described the aftermath, the burial of Emma and the adoption of her brothers, the prosecutor's decision not to pursue charges, the preservation of the document that would remind future generations of what had happened and why. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that justice had been done and that the community could now move forward. The debt paid, the balance restored. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded differently than they did to other songs of mountain justice. There was less weeping, less emotional intensity, and more of what one performer described as solemn satisfaction, as though the listeners took comfort from the knowledge that their ancestors had acted openly and deliberately rather than hiding behind anonymity. The song became a kind of anthem for the region, performed at gatherings where the community celebrated its identity and its values. The melody itself became one of the most recognizable in the regional repertoire, its distinctive pattern of rising and falling notes, instantly identifiable, even when played without words. Musicians would sometimes perform just the melody at gatherings, letting the audience supply the words from memory, the participatory nature of the performance, reinforcing the collective nature of the action the song commemorated. Another song focused specifically on the signatures, imagining the thoughts of individual signatories as they added their names to the declaration. This song had a more personal quality, its verses describing farmers and miners and mothers who each made the decision to commit themselves to an act that they knew might have consequences, who weighed the risks and decided that justice for Emma outweighed whatever punishment might follow. The song suggested that each signature represented a moral choice, a moment when an individual decided what they believed and what they were willing to do about it. One verse of this song described a young mother who had nursed her own child while Emma starved, who had offered to take the girl in and been refused, who had signed the declaration with a fury that reflected her identification with the child who had been denied the care that her own child received. Another verse described an elderly farmer who had watched 4 generations of children grow up in the hollow, who understood that the community's survival depended on the protection of its young, who signed with a hand that trembled from age but that formed the letters of his name with unmistakable determination. A third song told the story from Thomas's perspective, the 12-year-old boy who had watched his sister starve, who had found her body on the morning of her death, who had then witnessed his father's execution and been taken into a new home by the very people who had killed him. This song explored the complexity of the boy's position, the grief and relief and confusion that must have characterized his experience, the process of rebuilding a life from the wreckage that his father had created. The melody for this song was particularly haunting, a minor key that seemed to capture the isolation and confusion of a child caught between love for a sister he could not save and hatred for a father he could not escape. The song did not try to resolve the contradictions of Thomas's position, but simply presented them, letting listeners draw their own conclusions about how such a child might have felt and how he might have processed what he had witnessed. A fourth song addressed the prosecutor, James Taylor, treating his decision not to pursue charges as a recognition that the community's justice was legitimate, even if it was not legal. The song portrayed Taylor sympathetically, as a man caught between his duty to enforce the law and his understanding that the law had failed to protect Emma Pitts and could not reasonably punish those who had responded to that failure. The song's chorus asked, "What would you have done?" repeatedly, turning Taylor's dilemma into a question that every listener was invited to consider. A fifth song focused on Emma herself, imagining her life from birth to death, painting a portrait of a child who deserved better than she received. This was the saddest of all the songs, its melody barely more than a whisper, its lyrics describing a girl who loved to play and sing, but who was too weak to do either, who watched other children with longing eyes, who died believing that she had done something wrong to deserve her fate. Musicians reported that this song was rarely requested because it was too painful to hear, that audiences would sometimes leave rather than listen to it performed. The historians who have studied the Pitts case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as a unique example of documented community justice, arguing that the signed declaration represented an attempt to transform extra-legal violence into something approaching legitimate governance. The community that killed Robert Pitts did not hide its actions but proclaimed them, did not scatter into anonymity but stood together in acknowledged responsibility, created a record that was clearly intended to establish the legitimacy of what they had done. Others have focused on the legal dimensions of the case, examining how the existence of the declaration shaped the prosecutor's response. Taylor's memorandum made clear that he believed prosecution was not merely impractical, but unwise, that the community's documented consensus represented something that the legal system should acknowledge rather than challenge. This interpretation suggests that the declaration achieved its purpose, that by openly stating their intention and their reasons, the signatories created a situation where prosecution became effectively impossible. The sociological analysis has examined the composition of the signatories, noting that they represented a broad cross-section of the community rather than a particular faction or interest group. Farmers signed alongside miners, merchants alongside laborers, women alongside men. The diversity of the signatories suggested that the execution of Robert Pitts represented a genuine community consensus rather than the will of a particular group imposed upon the rest. The psychological analysis has examined the process by which individuals decided to sign, the moral reasoning that led 767 people to commit themselves to an act that they knew was illegal and that might have serious consequences. The analysis suggests that the public nature of the signing created a dynamic in which participation became a test of community membership, a way of demonstrating commitment to shared values that made non-participation a kind of betrayal. The gender analysis has noted the significant participation of women among the signatories, a feature that distinguished the Pitts case from many other acts of community justice, where women were present as witnesses but not as acknowledged participants. The women who signed the declaration were claiming a role in the community's governance that the formal legal system did not recognize, asserting that their voices counted in matters of life and death just as the voices of men did. The economic analysis has examined the class dynamics that shaped the case, noting that Robert Pitts's decline had been partly economic, a failure to maintain the productivity that mountain life demanded. His execution can be understood partly as the community's enforcement of standards of competence and responsibility, a warning to others who might be tempted to give up that the community would not tolerate those who endangered its most vulnerable members. The religious analysis has examined the role of faith in shaping the community's response, noting that the declaration's language invoked principles of natural law and divine justice that went beyond the secular legal system. The signatories believed that they were acting not merely on their own authority, but on behalf of a higher power that demanded justice for innocent victims, that their action was sanctioned by God, even if it was prohibited by man. You see, what happened in Wise County in October of 1891 cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. 767 people conspired to commit murder, documented their conspiracy in writing, carried out the killing, and escaped prosecution only because their numbers made it impractical to pursue them. The fact that their victim was guilty of a terrible crime does not eliminate the fact that they denied him the due process that the Constitution guaranteed, that they acted as judge, jury, and executioner, without the authority that only the state can legitimately confer. And yet the Pitts case cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of mob violence that teaches only the obvious lesson that lynching is wrong. A 6-year-old child had been starved to death by her own father, had suffered for months while he consumed the food that should have sustained her, had died weighing less than she had weighed at 3 years old, because the man responsible for her care had chosen to feed himself rather than her. The legal system that should have protected Emma had failed, and the legal system that should have punished her killer offered no guarantee that justice would be done. The community that signed the declaration understood the gravity of what they were doing. They were not acting in the heat of passion, but with deliberation, not hiding their actions, but proclaiming them, not claiming ignorance of the law, but asserting that higher principles demanded their action. They believed that what they were doing was right, that the circumstances justified their response, that future generations would understand and approve. The document they created was intended to explain their reasoning to anyone who might later question it. The moral complexity of the case is deepened by the existence of the declaration itself. By documenting their intention before acting, the signatories transformed what might have been impulsive violence into deliberate policy. They had time to reconsider, time to step back from the brink, time to let the legal system attempt to do what they believed it could not. They chose to proceed anyway, and they chose to document that choice in writing that would survive them. The question of whether they were right has no easy answer. Those who condemn their action must explain what alternative they should have pursued, must account for the fact that the law provided no clear mechanism for punishing Robert Pitts adequately for starving his daughter to death. Those who defend their action must explain what limiting principle prevents such community declarations from being used to justify violence against anyone whom a majority chooses to condemn, must account for the danger that documented consensus could become a tool of oppression rather than justice. The descendants of those 767 signatories still live in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, carrying memories passed down through generations about what their ancestors did and why. Family stories speak of great-grandparents who signed the declaration, who walked to the clearing where Robert Pitts was executed, who came home to their own children with a renewed determination to be the kind of parents that Pitts had failed to be. The event is not remembered with shame, but with a complicated pride, an understanding that what was done was terrible but necessary. The declaration itself remains in the Wise County archives, available to researchers who wish to examine the signatures and read the language that Ezra Collins crafted more than a century ago. The document has been digitized and can be viewed online. Its 7 pages of signatures, a testament to a moment when a community chose to document its will and act upon it. Scholars continue to debate its meaning, to argue about whether it represents a legitimate expression of community values or a dangerous precedent for extra-legal violence. The grave of Emma Pitts is still maintained, still visited by those who know her story, still marked by the stone that the community erected more than a century ago. The inscription has weathered, but remains legible. The biblical reference still carrying its promise of peace for a child who knew little peace in her short life. Flowers are placed at the grave each spring, the tradition maintained by descendants of the neighbors who failed to save Emma in life, but who honored her in death. The site where Robert Pitts was executed is marked now, unlike many other locations associated with community justice in Appalachia. A small stone was placed at the base of the oak tree, which still stands, bearing only a date and the number 767. The stone was placed by descendants of the signatories who believed that what their ancestors had done deserved to be remembered, that the community's action should be commemorated rather than hidden. The story of what happened in Wise County endures because it raises questions that have no easy answers, questions about law and justice, community and individual, the protection of the innocent, and the punishment of the guilty. It is a story about what happens when a community decides that official channels have failed and that direct action is required, about the documentation of intent that transforms violence into policy, about the 767 people who signed their names to a declaration and then carried out what they had declared. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at Emma's grave, to read the inscription that has weathered more than a century of mountain seasons, to feel the weight of a story that moved 767 people to sign their names and act upon their conviction? Would you visit the archives where the declaration is preserved? Would you examine the signatures of people who believed so strongly in what they were doing that they were willing to document their participation in a capital crime? Would you find the oak tree where Robert Pitts was executed? Would you read the small stone that commemorates what happened there? The journey to Wise County is easier now than it was in 1891, the roads paved and the towns connected to the wider world in ways that the mountain people of that era could not have imagined. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of the innocent and the guilty rest in those mountains. The declaration remains in the archives. The story continues to be told by those who believe it matters. The mountains keep their secrets, but not this one. This story has been preserved in writing, documented in a way that most acts of community justice never were. The 767 signatures are testament to a moment when a community chose to act openly and accept responsibility for what it did. It is a story about what happens when a father forgets his duty, when a child pays the ultimate price, when a community decides that some failures of care cannot go unanswered. It is a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about law and justice, about the limits of official authority, about what communities can legitimately do when the systems that are supposed to protect the innocent fail to do so. And that, my friend, is the true story of what happened in Wise County in the autumn of 1891, when 767 neighbors signed their names to a declaration stating their intention to execute Robert Pitts for starving his 6-year-old daughter to death, when a community chose to document its will and act upon it, when the mountains witnessed an act of collective justice that was recorded for posterity in a way that no other such act has ever been. A story of a child's death and a community's fury, of documented intent and deliberate action, of 767 signatures on 7 pages that remain in the archives to this day. Proof that what happened was not the work of an anonymous mob, but the deliberate choice of a community that counted itself and found itself united. The mountains remember, the document preserves, and through both, so do we all.